Our next speaker will be Illtud Dunsford. Now, Illtud was born and raised in Cardiff, but spent most of his spare time on his grandparents' dairy farm in the Gwendraeth Valley. He was trained as a photographer, and Illtud worked for the Wales Screen Commission, helping with the production of films, including Harry Potter, Robin Hood, and King Arthur. But he soon was drawn back to his farming roots and moved on to the family farm, where he set up a meat curing company, producing a range of pork products. In 2010, he became a HCC Scholar. Illtud.
I feel a little unprepared today. I don't have any rugby anecdotes in my presentation, so I'm sorry, but you're going to have to live without those. Right. So, when we think of the influence of North America on our food culture, we invariably think of fast food and the domination of the large supermarkets. So, why of all places did I choose the Pacific Northwest of the USA to look at pork production and specifically charcuterie production? Having visited a number of production facilities in Italy, it was obvious that both tradition and the natural climate contributed largely to the product that was being made. When asked why something was done in a specific way, the answer would invariably be, that's how it's always been done. It was all about tradition. Having moved to the family farm in 2004, the tradition of curing of our own pork fell to me. We'd never been large-scale breeders. At one time we bred saddlebacks, but in recent years we'd moved to buying 3 or 4 weaners every year from more commercial breeds, fattening them through the autumn and slaughtering on farm in winter. So back to that question, why North America? The reason's twofold. Fast food aside, the USA has an extremely complex food culture. Their lifestyle means that they eat out far more than we do, and their food culture is a good 10 years ahead of ours, especially when it comes to naturally produced, locally sourced and artisan produced food. Additionally, when it came to the annual slaughter, while I was scavenging around online for any information on Southern European curing, more often than not, the information I came across was from blogs by Italian-American immigrants producing charcuterie in their closets, basements and garages. The breadth of pork products that we have in our supermarkets isn't available in the US. So this immigrant population were looking to their own family recipes to produce cured products for that taste of home. I've been using the word charcuterie, so what does it mean? Well, in its most basic terms, it's the craft of salting, curing, smoking, or drying. Like so many other French culinary terms, charcuterie is being naturalized into the English language. Sophie Grigson, from a book on French pork cookery, describes its history in French terms as deriving as far back as the time of classical Rome. The charcutier, the person who creates the charcuterie, would sell a variety of sausages and hams at that time, largely in the form of very basic salted meat for the travelling armies. From the 15th century, this extended to any form of cooked pork and raw fat, and from the early 17th century, charcutiers gained the right to sell all cuts of uncooked pork as well as fat. This established what we now think of as charcuterie. This would include pâtés, terrines, head cheeses, potted meats, fresh sausages, semi-dry sausages, bacon, cured ham, gammon, whole cured mussels, like air-dried ham. More often than not, when charcuterie is used in a more modern context, it relates to air-dried meats. And there are other words that are used. The Italians use salumi, which includes air-dried ham, guanciale, pancetta, coppa, salami, as well as cooked meats like prosciutto cotto and mortadella. Most of these processing techniques were forms of preserving meat before the advent of refrigeration. As a family, the method we use to cure our own pigs are nearly identical to those used in Llandudno in the Parma region to produce Parma ham. The big difference is the way we use the product. Our heavily salted bacons and hams would have been soaked and boiled or fried rather than eaten raw. What tradition we had as a nation of curing and air drying is largely being lost. Our tastes have changed, and the advent of refrigeration has made those farmers who still salt in this method a very rare thing. However, we do have a rich history of pork cookery in the UK. We have a huge range of regional ham variations, faggots, black puddings, prawns, and all manner of pies. So for the modern producer and processor, charcuterie in whatever form provides a way of creating a value-added or premium pork product. Climate also plays a part. Although the French and the Italians have modernized the methods they use to produce their air-dried produce, introducing environmental control chambers, regulating the temperature and humidity, they also use the natural environment. Their factories are built so that the natural airflow of the valley can pass through the buildings. In Parma, they open the doors and windows every morning and evening to allow the breeze to pass through. With this breeze comes the naturally occurring mould that aids in the drying process and gives the produce its distinctive flavours. Although we can produce air-dried products in our climate, they do vary greatly. We have a colder, more humid climate, and the fungi and moulds that are naturally occurring here are very different. Therefore, we have to look to systems of producing air-dried cured meats in wholly environmentally controlled chambers. With such a variety of climates across the US, they too have the same problem. They've looked to European production, disseminated that information, and built their own designs of climate chambers, often doing away with processes that have formed part of the European tradition. As I'm limited for time, I'll concentrate on one or two breeders and producers in particular that I met. The very first person I contacted prior to the trip was a man called Heath Putnam. In artisan pork production in the US, he's a bit of a pork rock star. In 2004, after a trip to Austria, he decided to be the first to import a rather obscure breed of pig called the Mangalitsa. He formed his own company, Woolly Pigs, and sold his first carcass to the French Laundry, which at the time was a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant and was rated the best in the world. Now, the Mangalitsa are a rather unusual breed. They're a lard-producing pig with a curly coat, and they resemble more of a sheep or a womble than a pig. Their composition is similar to that of the Pata Negra, the Iberian black pig, though they're much hardier and would suit our climate due to their thick coats. From a genetic perspective, the breed is extremely similar to the now extinct Lincolnshire curly-coated pig. And there was also mention of a Hereford pig that also resembled the Mangalitsa. They're a small-boned animal with a muscle structure similar to wild boar and provide high killing-out percentages, though their primary benefit is their distinctive fat. The fat itself is lower in polyunsaturated fat, higher in monounsaturated fat, and has a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids comparable to seed oils. It essentially makes it a healthier animal fat. Being a lard pig, it's not usually kept solely for its meat, although the meat itself has intense marbling, as you can see, and the pork, in the pork world, it's the equivalent of the Japanese Wagyu cattle. They're an extremely slow-growing breed. Some of the animals that I saw, which were ready for slaughter, were over 3 years of age and only weighed in at 200 kilograms. Heath had worked tirelessly over the past 7 years promoting the breed across America. He'd carved a niche for himself, and he'd also found a market, and it's very high value. His wholesale meat prices range between £7 and £15 a kilo, and double that for direct sales. His animals were contract bred by a series of farmers across the country, but mainly concentrated in intensive units in Iowa, and he paid per animal per day, and they were all fed in a varied diet. The only consistency from one breeder to the next was in the finishing of the animals, 4 pounds of barley per day for the last 60 days. Now, traditionally in Austria, they adhere to strict feeding rules, sticking to barley, hay, and fresh vegetables for the animal's whole life. As a feed comparison, the growing animals were fed about a quarter ration per day of what we would traditionally feed a developed breed here in the UK. Though at 18 months, they'd have a target weight of around 100 kilograms. In comparison to Heath's intensive methods, I also visited Shane Peterson at Suisun Valley Farm in California. It was a damp, misty morning when I made the journey to his farm. It's a stone's throw from the famous wine-producing area of the Napa Valley, and his farm was nestled in amongst vineyards. At the farm, when I met Shane, who's a biochemist, we were loading up some animals that were going to slaughter that following day. Or that day, sorry. He bought his breeding stock from Heath and was now the main breeder in California. He feeds his pigs on a custom-made pellet of wheat, alfalfa and minerals, and they're also fed hay and are allowed to graze for 6 months of the year. He supplements his feed with vegetables and rents a few acres to a local grower who produces tomatoes, squash and pumpkin. As would be my luck, I was there on the first day of the rainy season. Generally 6 months of sun followed by 6 months of rain. And as the rainy season would encourage mold and mildew growth on the vegetables, that morning we just collected the glut of tomatoes from the vines. That morning Bob, a local cattle rancher, came to pick up 3 animals due for slaughter. The largest was a 30-month-old castrated boar, and all his animals are slaughtered at a minimum age of 18 months. Based on the analytical information he collated from various slaughters, marbling in the meat peaks at 9 months, and then between 12 and 18 months the meat quality develops, and post 18 months they plateau in weight, though the animals put on fat even on a full fibre diet. All his largest animals are destined for the French laundry, and as part of their charcuterie programme. I'd spoken with the head of the programme prior to my trip, but my timing was pretty poor as he was in London setting up a pop-up restaurant in Harrods, offering meals at £270 a head. Later in the day we called to see his pigs at the slaughterhouse. It was an unlicensed premises run by an Italian slaughterman in his 80s. He'd used licensed slaughterhouses, but he had to travel 3 hours to get there, and due to the high throughput, they didn't provide the same level of care when it came to slaughter. Although I'm quite used to slaughtering at home, I was quite shocked to see that one of the world's leading restaurants was having illegal kills in this way. Each animal was being stamped with a blueberry ink saying not for sale, but it didn't seem to bother any of the purchasers that were picking up their animals. Shane was getting between £8 and £10 a kilo wholesale for his produce, and he only sold whole carcasses. A few days later I went on a delivery run with him to San Francisco, and you can see how we delivered. In 30-degree heat we travelled an hour and a half carrying 3 carcasses in the back of a pickup truck on some plastic wrap, and we're selling to some of the best restaurants in the world. The restaurant that we stopped at, Pabaco, sold some of his cured products, and they were $40 a head for a starter, so about £30, yeah. So the day I spent with Mark Keller, the Keller Meat Group, was probably my most enjoyable of the whole trip. It was also my most tiring. I met Mark at 6 AM at the family-owned Premier Meat Processing plant. And like many other producers I met on the trip, they hired spaces within larger production plants who had spare capacity. Although he grew up in an urban area, he'd always wanted a farm. His first job was as the first meat employee for Prather Ranch, running their commercial slaughter program. At the time, they were a standard ranch producing high-quality beef, making their first foray into selling direct to consumer. 40,000-acre ranch, part owned by Walter Ralph, who owned a supermarket chain in California called Ralph's. Today, Prather Ranch is seen as the premier meat supplier in Northern California, selling organic, hormone-free, antibiotic-free beef. They also have large commercial wholesale operations and retail outlets across San Francisco Bay Area. Various jobs in the meat industry followed, including assisting Boccolone, a San Francisco-based charcuterie company, in setting up and working, in addition, setting up a community-supported agriculture meat box scheme for the slow food movement in Berkeley, in California. So in 2009, he sold everything, moved from San Francisco, and headed north to Redding in California to establish a herd of large black pigs. He'd chosen the area specifically because he'd found a meat processor who was willing to give him a chance, and good farming land was plentiful and cheap. He couldn't manage both the herd of 3,000 pigs and the weekly processing on his own. So earlier last year, he moved his animals north to Carlton Farms in Oregon. And Carlton Farms are the main meat supplier for most of the producers that I met during the trip. They're the market leader for traceable, sustainable pork, and they ultimately produce commercial pork from rare breeds. Mark's done things a little different from everyone else. His arrangement with Carlton Farms is they breed and raise his large blacks to his specification. They slaughter the animals and cut them to spec. They're then shipped to him, and he produces bacon and deli products, with the vast majority returning to Carlton Farms for them to sell under their own label. He also processes for Prather Ranch and produces any produce that's remaining is sold in farmers markets. He processes 120 carcasses single-handed every week. The day that I was there was spent trimming, brine injecting, vacuum tumbling, and hanging 124 bellies ready for hot smoking and thermal processing. In the afternoon, we trimmed, macerated, emulsified, vacuum tumbled, and netted 96 legs worth of ham ready for smoking and cooking. His aspirations were huge, and he's currently working with another business partner to set up a show farm, somewhere where people can visit to see the animals, to taste the product, and hopefully to take it home with them. He isn't interested in selling to foodies. His direct market is families, high-quality ingredients for everyday food. He isn't interested in owning his own facility. The company that he rents from, Premier Meats, have seen a dramatic downturn in their product sales, and they see Mark as a lifeline for the facility. So his next step was to cut down on processing costs at the slaughterhouse by putting in a butchery line. A number of the contacts I made on the trip were thanks to various forms of social media, whether it was Twitter, Facebook, or via blogs. And as part of the trip, I kept a daily blog. So if you'd like to read more about the trip, have a look at charcuterie.co.uk and then click on the blog tab. But as a form of relaying what I learned on the trip, it was extremely valuable, because in the first year, there were about 12,000 hits on the website in terms of people reading about pork production. And it's an excellent way. I know social media takes a lot of time to manage, but if you have the time, it's a great way of contacting other people within your own industry and also your customers. So how does this translate to pork production for us here in Wales? Well, our farming heritage, from a pork perspective, is largely in the form of a cottager's tradition, keeping a pig or two at the bottom of the garden. We don't have an established pork industry, and for that very reason we have to look at niche markets, providing products of exceptional high quality that adds value. From a personal perspective, I fully expected the trip to be biased towards production. I was happy to see that actual process was secondary, and what became important whenever I met a new producer was their key ingredient, the pigs. The first questions would always be about breed, feed, slaughter age, weight, fat quality, and curing quality. You often hear here in the UK that a pig should be rare breed, free-ranged, raised to a high welfare standard, and all those things are valid. But when it comes to charcuterie, what I came to fully understand was how imperative it was the best ingredient for a long-term cure. You need hard fats, plenty of marbling, intramuscular fats, a docile, low-stress animal, feed that's low in polyunsaturated fat, no maize, no soya, very little wheat, and if possible a grazing breed who'd also eat hay in winter. A slow-growing animal, raised for a minimum of 12 months to weights in the region of 150 kilos. In the US and the wider pork industry, the educated consumer were turning their backs on mass-produced commodity pork. Big agriculture was losing ground, and small butchery stores and farmers markets were on the up. People in urban areas were clambering to join Meet Your Meat courses in order to strengthen their understanding of pork production. It's those key aspects that I've taken back to my own business. Traceability is key, and finding the right animal, the right feed, and the right husbandry method is crucial for every specific product. We currently process pedigree Welsh pigs, sourced through members of the Pedigree Welsh Pig Society. They breed to our specification, finish to a specified feed, and to high kill weights. As the business grows and we expand the number of producers, we hope that we can use the business model of the community-supported agricultural schemes that we saw in the US in order to pay our breeders a fair price and to share the risk between us as businesses. For the past 18 months, we've also been rearing some Womble pigs of our own, and they went to slaughter about 6 weeks ago. Sales of bacon and Womble burgers done quite well, but it still remains to be seen whether they're a suitable pig for us to consider as part of our breeding program. The next step for us, well, we've secured planning permission, and we're currently through the first competitive bidding round of the current processing and marketing scheme. And fingers crossed, our former milking parlour will be a cutting room in 6 months' time. Just one final thing. The benefit to our business in experience and the knowledge that we gained from this trip outweighs the financial contribution. And I encourage anyone, it doesn't matter how old you are, to go abroad and have a look at systems. It doesn't matter whether it's the pork industry, lamb, beef. It's really important that you take a look at what people are doing abroad. And taking points from what each of the speakers have already said today, it's always important that you take those little things when you hear them and you add them to your business, because that's the only way that you can move on forward and become stronger. Thank you.